This is Resonance 104.4 FM, flipping marvellous. I'm Nick Hennigan, so there, what can you do about it? And welcome to another episode of Literary London, where we're really going to get stuck into the literature of London. It is my great pleasure to welcome once again to Resonance FM and to Literary London, Cahal Dallat. I've said that right, haven't I, Cahal?
Oh yeah, perfectly. Yeah,
Thank you. I should have checked. But Cahal Dallat, poet, writer, critic, and currently champion of an incredible fundraising celebration of the poet W.B. Yeats. We've already talked about this once before, and we'll talk about it again. But just tell us a little bit about yourself, Cahal, what you're up to and where you're from and how things
Yeah. Okay, well, I came to Bedford Park in Chiswick. I guess I was about 20 with my then girlfriend, who is, in fact, returning from a trip to Paris. My girlfriend, who's now my wife, Anne-Marie Fife, who's a poet. We weren't both poets then, although we'd both been dabbling back in Belfast. And so we were kind of attracted to Chiswick because it's such a lovely place. But also stepping down the steps of Turnham Green Tube Station, I stepped out and looked round and immediately saw that this was Bedford Park. I'd had a very good English teacher, Sister Vincentia, who was a nun who had been at the very first Yeats summer school back in the 50s and was an enthusiast for Yeats. And so I'd learned an awful lot about Yeats at A level. And so I looked at Bedford Park and thought, this is where we want to live. This is where John Butler Yeats brought his family up and all that. Well, a lot of years have passed since then, and I've done a number of other things, including broadcasting, writing books of poetry, teaching poetry. So there's a lot of poetry teaching that Anne-Marie and I have done around West London. In Anne-Marie ran the Troubadour venue at Earl's Court for a long time. We moved our classes and workshops to Chiswick, to Arts Ed, and of course then we've been doing an awful lot more on air since lockdown, as everyone has. So we still do regular poetry events. I've got one coming up next week with an American poet. One of the things Anne-Marie has focused on is transatlantic, because Zoom gives you the chance to do that, whereas it wasn't so easy to fly them over from San Francisco to a little basement in Earl's Court. So, that's basically what we do, is anything to do with poetry. We've run poetry events at the Bedford Park Festival for many years. And one of the very first of those in 1999 was a W.B. Yeats evening. And we had another W.B. Yeats evening in 2015, celebrating the fact that it was Yeats' 150th birthday, with people like Fergal Keane and Rowan Williams and so on there. And out of that came the idea. Of course, I've been doing Yeats walks, as you know, Nick, because you've trudged the roadways on the pavements grey, as Yeats would have put it.
With me. Very good they are too, as well.
We've been doing those for a long time. But of course, you can only get those to so many people. But that brings me on to the next part of our story. So anything to do with poetry, certainly anything to do with poetry in West London, though we have spent a lot of time in America talking there about Irish poetry, talking about our own poetry. But right now, the big focus is on Yeats. And his story in Bedford Park, the fact that he was an Irish Londoner, as many of us are. I take it with Hennigan, you're a kind of Irish Londoner yourself.
Absolutely, yes, from Mayo. My effects are from Mayo.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. There is a Hennigan's pub in Sligo, which is where Yeats' mother came from, and people at the Yeats summer school all adjourned to Hennigan's pub. So Hennigans are well rooted in the west of Ireland.
Yeah. I like the sound of that. Yes, I've not been there yet, but there was that book. Was it? I forgot the chap who wrote the book about Never Pass a Pub with Your Name on it. So.
Oh right, yes, yeah. I mean, one of the things that we hope will happen. It's a bit of a two-way approach. Of course, we want lots of people to come to Bedford Park, but when they read the story, I think an awful lot more people will want to see the landscape and legends and lores that inspired the young Yeats, that gave him such longing for his mother's home place in the west of Ireland, that produced poetry. Of course, his poetry isn't all about longing and so on, but that's kind of the nucleus of it. And so one of the things that the Bedford Park project will do is, I think, get more people going and experiencing that beautiful wildness, which is the other half of Yeats's life.
So there's actually, the specific projects that we're talking about now, there's sort of two halves to it, isn't there? So the first thing to say, well, just tell us a bit about W.B. Yeats and his connection with London and what Bedford Park's all about, because it's quite a special place. So W4, isn't it? We're W4, Stamford Brook Tube Station and turn right. Turnham Green Tube Station and turn right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story. Yeats's father studied for the law, but decided he wanted to be a painter. And if you wanted to be a painter in the 19th century, you had to be in London, because that's where all the artists, actors, titled heads, etc., were there to be painted. That's where patronage came from. So he moved rather to his wife's chagrin or unhappiness, because she loved the west of Ireland and was very happy and thought they would live in Ireland. So anyway, they moved here, and like many migrant families, and I think this is why Yeats is a kind of an almost iconic figure for migrant families. They moved from one place to another. They never really settled. Sometimes they'd go back to Ireland. Sometimes they'd send the kids back to Ireland to be brought up by granny, which is not an uncommon experience for exiled families or migrant families. And eventually, when they were in Kensington, in rooms in Kensington, John Butler Yeats heard a story that an Irish developer, Jonathan Carr, was building this village out in the country. Of course, Chiswick was out in the country then. It was countryside from Hammersmith to Acton. And Chiswick had always been a place where artists went to paint, to write, right back sort of as far as Edmund Spenser and so on. Chiswick was this lovely pastoral place. But someone was building a village there on arts and crafts principles. So there's a big William Morris thing here. There was a big sense of getting back to nature, the village structure. The whole place would be villagey with windy roads and trees. But it would also be a community of artists. And so for him, that was absolutely magic, because he wanted to be among artists. You would think a painter would want to be away from other artists so he could stand out on his own and be noticed. But in fact, they relied terribly much on each other. And it wasn't just artists, it was intellectuals. There was an underlying feeling of American transcendentalism. Walt Whitman's poetry was the kind of in thing for this generation. This is Yeats's father's generation, and young Willie Yeats is growing up. So the whole place was built in this idea of a better life than in industrial Victorian Britain. He loved it because he was kind of celebrated as a great Irish raconteur and talker and wit and theorizer about art and so on. And his wife was always telling the children stories about Ireland. So there was a great tension there about how lovely Ireland was, and he was just excited to be in the middle of all this. And so the kids grew up with that tension, love of Ireland, the buzz of the capital, the buzz of the artistic community, the wonders of Bedford. I mean, Bedford Park, if you think about it, in 1888, building a development that had in it a club, a church, a pub. The club admitted men and women on an equal basis, unheard of in London clubs. It had its own sports ground, and they were mostly rented houses, so they certainly weren't for the very rich. It wasn't Mayfair or Kensington. They weren't for the very poor either. But this was for a sort of a lower middle class, arty, bohemian, utopian, and so they were all very egalitarian, anti-imperial, and multicultural. So W.B. Yeats, as a young boy, grew up in that magical atmosphere. He writes wonderfully about it, not so much in his poems, but in his autobiography, about how it was like a place out of a storybook. People dressed like people out of a storybook. And I think there were a lot of eccentrics. I'm not saying there aren't a lot of eccentrics in Chiswick right now, but there certainly were then. So he grew up in that atmosphere, and that encouraged him to write. And so basically, he has gone on to be the hero of Irish literature, Ireland's great national poet, although Seamus Heaney, a friend when I was growing up, became the second great national poet. And there are hundreds. There are thousands of other great Irish poets, so I say no disrespect to them all, but Yeats still is outstanding, partly because of his wonderful poetry that's so loved by ordinary people in Ireland and in English, throughout the English-speaking world. But secondly, because the poetry that he wrote in London helped to revive Celtic culture. His sisters were also involved in the craft industry. His brother became a famous modern painter, but he was and through his little dabblings in the Bedford Park Club and going to amateur theatre there, he eventually created the Abbey Theatre, one of the world's most famous theatres. So out of this comes an Irish cultural revival, which in turn accounts for Ireland's place, taking its place among the nations in the 1920s and 30s and becoming an independent country. So Ireland loves him for two reasons, if you like. And London has sort of gone, oh yes, there was that chap over there somewhere, and so once we found a bit of time to really talk about this, and after the Great Yeats celebrations in 2015, the number of local people who were interested in saying, well, not just great to celebrate Yeats, but it kind of proves how Bedford Park fostered Yeats, nurtured him, became the crucible that turned that exile's longing into Nobel Prize winning gold. I mean, it is a kind of an alchemical process. And so, as you say, there's a project there. The first part of the project was called Celebrate W.B. Yeats in Bedford Park. And so we were looking for an artist who would envisage that thing. Can you go to somebody and say, imagine somebody's genius springing up from the very ground he's walking on. Imagine he wants to celebrate gold and silver light as Yeats always did, and so on. And we were terribly fortunate because we had two launches of the project. One was in the London Buddhist Vihara, which Yeats would have loved because he was fascinated by Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and so on. Eastern teaching was very in Bedford Park in the 1890s. So we had a launch there. We also had a launch in the Irish Embassy, because you can imagine the Irish Embassy are fascinated by the idea that a London suburb wants to celebrate Ireland's national poet as a school kid, as a kid who grew up there. So we had that launch, and the great Kieran Hines, National Theatre actor, but people will probably know him from Game of Thrones or from The Terror more recently. So Kieran did some readings for us, and he read He Wishes from the Cloths of Heaven, and read those lines about "enwrought with gold and silver light." And Conrad Shawcross, the artist who we'd invited to the event, and who we liked the idea of Conrad because Yeats was a literary person from an artistic family, and Conrad is an artistic person from a literary family. His father's William Shawcross, an author. His mother's Marina Warner, who is a very famous academic and a Yeatsian. So we were focusing on him, and he came out of that lecture and having listened to Kieran's reading and said he wanted to create something that was enwrought with gold and silver light. And that idea of enwrought is kind of very Victorian William Morrissey, working something out of light, pure light. And so we came up with this beautiful image, and we got down into the detail, and it was going to cost us, we'd already spent a good deal, something like 24,500 on setting up infrastructure, planning permission, and so on. Conrad's piece was 135,000, so it took us from March to July to raise that, but phenomenal response to that. I mean, if you think about it, people as diverse as Irish Embassy, of course, London Borough of Hounslow, Royal Academy were interested in it as pure artwork, but not loads of local residents and actors, poets, academics, etc. People like Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin guitarist, chipped in. So many people got involved in this. And so we got to July and finally we've got a sum of money raised in which we can create this literary landmark. And then the question hangs over all that. So are you still going to do the walking tours? And that's where we come on to the second part of it,
Right. So it's a sort of a statue, isn't it? How tall is it? Sorry.
I can give you a very quick look at it. Is that?
Yeah, please do. Yes. Yeah. Again, we're on Residence 104.4 FM, also on Bohemian Britain, of course, bohemianbritain.com, and on YouTube. And if you're listening on the radio, you'll look very carefully. We're in stereo, and here's going to come a picture of the W.B. Yeats
artwork. The artwork. Yeah. If you just let me share a screen there, Nick.
Sure. Oh, of course, that's what I did. Let me just sort this one out. Multiple participants. There we go.
And what we're looking at is that's how it's going to look outside St. Michael and All Angels Church, just next to Turnham Green Station. And it's a great spiraling gyre. Yeats was interested in how civilization moved in gyres and spirals and so on. For lots of people, it's like a flock of birds spinning up from the ground. It's like autumn leaves being caught in a tussle of wind, the trees in their autumn beauty. And it's like a host of angels outside St. Michael and All Angels. Yeats was very influenced. This was their parish church, of course, the Yeats family. And angels were very much in the William Morris world, the arts and crafts world, and so on. So the actual dedication of the church to St. Michael and All Angels, and then Yeats grew up with that, and there are angels all over his poetry. So this is kind of like, it's whatever you want it to be, of course, but it's the spiraling genius, not just of Yeats, but of Bedford Park, whose ideas, whose contemporary progressive ideas spiraled up and out into the world. And so that's going to be what you see from Acton Green. If you walk up from Turnham Green Tube Station, you'll walk past that. And so that's the whole of phase one of the project. That will take until June of this year, Yeats's next birthday, to have that fully installed. There's a great circle. You probably can't see it terribly clearly in the picture, but there's a circular base with the words of the poem written around it, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half light. So that gives you a very quick look And of course, we can see everybody who's contributed, of course, people from writing to me from Texas and California and Japan are saying, here's a contribution. Oh, and by the way, we'll be along to see it when you unveil it. So we've got, at one level, a whole host of international, if you like, cultural tourists, but there's nothing wrong with that, because that's what London is very much about. But they're coming to see an Irish poet in the middle of London, as well as all the other literary sites in London. So we're delighted that that's happening. But of course, locally, people are suddenly aware of it and wondering, what's the story with Yeats? And so our puzzle is that, as you know from the literary walks, you take out 10, 15 people a couple of times a year and tell them the story, and everybody goes and says, that's fantastic, why don't more people know about it? And with the artwork, of course, they could all come along and read the sign, which says roughly what I've been saying to you. Yeats came to London at age 2, the family moved here, he went to Godolphin School, he wrote some poems, etc. But it's that much on a sign, because you can't put up a huge billboard with Yeats's whole life on it. In fact, the Bedford Park Society have a very good information pillar a few yards from where we'll be, which will tell people a lot about Bedford Park and a little about Yeats. So we're kind of liaising with that so we don't all double up, and so that we send them to look at our sign and so on. We send people to look at their sign. But the big question was, how do you communicate this? And in a sense, to me, it's a shared heritage that nobody has bothered to share. Can you say that? I mean, it's, in other words, everybody here owns a bit of the fact that they live in the place where all these good things happened. And people have tended to, the Bedford Park Society, of course, have been the custodians both of the ideals of Bedford Park and the fabric of Bedford Park. So it's a conservation area. They make sure that the place is beautifully preserved and that people understand the architectural history and the aesthetic ideas behind the architectural history. Absolutely. But there's a tendency to say, oh, so-and-so who was an artist lived here and another artist lived here and so on. Many of them, artists, actors, writers, came here after they'd made a success of their lives and found it a good place to be. The difference with Yeats is that he was brought up here. Bedford Park made him. I say that with some caution because Irish friends will be going, oh no, that's too big a claim. So, but Bedford Park, I mean, I think it's a story for migrants, for the capital generally. Lots of people come from different parts of the world. In London, because of publishing, theatre, community, networks, etc., you have a way of developing your own culture, whether you're from the Caribbean or whether you're from India or the west of Ireland. You have a place to develop your own culture, and the capital is interested. The capital is buzzing with that. And you have a chance to give something back to your own culture, as Yeats phenomenally did, and as so many other writers who passed through London did. So Yeats is I'm not saying London made me, but Ireland filtered through London. And we often celebrate the Irish contribution to London as all those people who came and built the roads, the nurses, the teachers, the road menders, even the cabbies and so on. But that's part of the story. The other part of the story is, and you think of every name in English literature, George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, Terence Rattigan, W.B. Yeats, Sean O'Casey, Oliver Goldsmith, Richard Sheridan, all Irish, and so had a particular angle on London life and a particular wit and creative imagination to bring. So it's celebrating London Irishness, but it's also celebrating the fact that, this is not getting political, but it is saying London in the late 19th century, or at least Bedford Park, was a place that was open to multiculturalism, was fascinated by Eastern religion, was fascinated by regional Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Celticism. There were French painters. Camille Pissarro and his family lived here. In fact, Nudo Rodo Pissarro actually moved into the Yeats' house after they left in Blenheim Road. So there are all these lovely little stories. There are Ukrainian anarchists. There is Madame Blavatsky, who's a Russian theosophist. There are Buddhists. Mancherji Bonagri, the second ever British Asian MP in the 19th century, this is not a new thing, lived in Bedford Park. Sarojini Naidu, who was called the Indian Yeats, visited the Yeatses, and Yeats's father did a portrait of her. So there's a wonderful multi-ethnic aspect and interest in, of course, it was all British Empire then, so naturally people came to London, but that interest was there. And that hasn't really been celebrated in Bedford Park. And when you think that Ealing, so 60% of Bedford Park is in Ealing. This is very detailed stuff, but 40% is in Hounslow, 60% is in Ealing. Both local authorities are very enthusiastic with the project. Ealing has the highest number of Irish heritage citizens, residents, anywhere in Britain, and doesn't really celebrate, hasn't really until now celebrated the fact that Ireland's national poet lived in Ealing, wrote some of his best poems in Ealing. His mother is buried in Ealing. You know, there's a whole set of family connections there that have somehow got forgotten because the Yeats has moved away and the rest of his life was about Ireland. Of course it was, you know, and the poetry is, of course, international, much wider than Ireland. So that led us to what's the second part of the project. You've got your landmark there. How are you going to tell people this story about Yeats? And so we're going in on, you might say, so many different fronts. Obvious ones, school work packs for children, which we're developing with local teachers, so that not only the schools around the area, but visiting schools will be able to access those online and give their kids poems to learn, poems to recite, poems that they can understand, because some of Yeats's poems are about age and exile. I mean, lots of people in London have parents or grandparents who came from somewhere else. That sense is not unusual. So there are themes there that kids can understand and write their own poems to. So that's a kind of a learning and a creative writing exercise. There will be a public lecture in which we'll bring lots of community organisations along. There will be an unveiling, of course, in which it will be public, but there'll be a reception for schools and so on. And then the permanent legacy part of it is that if you come along to this artwork and click on a sign, on the sign, there'll be a QR code there, and you will get on your smartphone, iPad, tablet, or whatever, a Google guide to Yeats's Bedford Park. Simple as that. It will give you 10 locations. I have to say 2 of them are outside Bedford Park. Chiswick down at the river, which is what inspired Yeats to write about the Lake Isle of Innisfree and Sligo. And he's written quite candidly about how that was a trigger for him. And William Morris's Kelmscott House, where Yeats went along to French lessons and political talks, and where he met people like Annie Besant, who went on to become the president of the Indian National Congress. I mean, Bedford Park and Hammersmith were really outgoing places then. So there are 10 points on the walk. It will take you with Google directions. When you get to a particular location, you'll look up and see the building. You'll see an image of the building, maybe as it was in 1890. You will see a little talk about the building and Yeats's context there, why he was interested in the Bedford Park Club, how he was involved with, how the family were involved with St. Michael and All Angels Church and how it inspired him, how his brother went to an art school where Arts Ed is now. So each of those little talks, and then a Yeats poem that's in context, that's related to that place. Basically, it's like doing the Yeats walk on your own or in a group, as long as you've got what practically everyone has now, or many people have, which is some kind of phone, iPhone, etc. And for me, that is one of the biggest things, is that lots of people have iPhones who have never gone on a literary walk, as you and I have, Nick. There are lots of people who have smartphones who have never paid to go into a writer's museum or read about the history of some guy who was writing in the Victorian period. There are lots of people who have access to personal devices who wouldn't actually sit through a Yeats lecture in a church hall or a university. And so it's those people, it's their heritage. It's their heritage as Londoners, as Chiswickers, as Ealing and Hounslow people, as many people in London are migrants or the children of migrants, or just ordinary folks who've never been told that the place they're living had this kind of dynamic explosion of ideas. So the permanent legacy, backed by those local authorities and all the people who've helped us, is the Yeats Walk is on tap 24/7, 365 days a year, for anybody who wants to experience it. And I think that's a great opening up.
Did you always have that in mind when you were coming up with the sort of statue? Was it in the back of your mind that part 2 would include this interactivity?
Yes, but it takes a long time to formulate it. It's hard to say how. I mean, one of the things is you could put all this on a website now and say, there's a story about Yeats on a website. We want people to come to Chiswick. We want them to walk around and see the buildings and understand how that atmosphere influenced them, rather than a dry 2 pages on a website. We've already got a fairly good website. Bedford Park Society have a great website. That's not what it's about. It's about coming here and experiencing a poetry place. The relationship between poetry and place, if you think of Wordsworth in the Lake District, if you think of Seamus Heaney in Mid-Ulster, if you think of Charles Causley down in Devon-Cornwall borders, there is a relationship between poetry and place, and much as you read about it, you don't experience it. And that's why I'd also advocate people someday going to the west of Ireland and standing looking up at Ben Bulben, this most majestic mountain, or standing on the shore at Ross's Point. But standing and looking at the leafy avenues of Bedford Park and thinking of Victorian London and its smouldering, smoky industrial railways and all that, and thinking this was a kind of a pastoral paradise that would allow a writer to develop. I mean, there's a lesson there too in terms of how the community allows a writer to develop. Writers aren't, as I think I might have believed when I was younger, somebody who sits alone in a garret and it all comes out of their brain. Writing is of course, it's an individual thing, but it comes out of being supported by a group, a network of writers. And that seems to me that Bedford Park expresses that perfectly. The right kind of neighborhood, the right kind of community produces stunning creativity. That's the story. Yeah, I'd take a long time telling it, but it'll be it'll be in much smaller pieces. And that's why somebody can sample the walk and leave a bit of it out, or take as much, and not everyone will do down to the river and across to Kelmscott House. There'll be a nucleus and a couple of outliers. That's inevitable in anybody's story.
Yeah, it's a nice. I mean, we still run. I mean, pre-COVID, we still run. I wrote the London Literary Pub Crawl, which goes out in Soho and Fitzrovia, and you can just see the effect on the people that come on that is to be in the Proles pub. But
absolutely.
That sensation you can't really replicate. And of course, the important thing, you're still raising money for this.
Right. So what we've got to do, I mean, we've had a fantastic start because we got all this lined up. Ealing helped us with their future reading plan. That it says fundraising, rather like the Space Hive fundraising we did last year. They've put in 8,000. As of today, we've got just under 16,000 so far. So in 4 weeks, lots of people have chipped in. I have to say, a number of them are people who had chipped in before for the artwork, but can see the other side of this project. And so we're actually doing quite well money-wise, but want anybody, and I guess you would put a link when you put this up on YouTube.
I will do. We're on London Literary Pub Crawl YouTube. We're on Bohemian Britain.
Sorry. No,
that's okay. It's all over the place. If you're listening on Resonance FM and you want to see Cahal and the lovely musical instruments that are behind you, which we won't really have time to talk about now, but they look fantastic, then do go to London Literary Pub Crawl YouTube, or go to bohemianbritain.com. So where can we find out more then, Cahal? We've run out of time again. Where can people go to find out more and to help support you?
Well, on the Space Hive site, if we can put that link up for people on our website, www.yeatsbedfordpark.com, and that will lead you to the Space Hive site, which is the fundraising site. If you go on Twitter, it's at Yeats Bedford Park. That's at YEATSBEDFORDPK. So at Yeats Bedford Park, not only is the story of the fundraising there, but little bits of the story of Yeats and who he knew and what he did on a certain day in 1889 and so on. We've been building that up. So there's a lovely story there that you can follow on Twitter. And of course, the more people you join on Twitter, the better.
Thank you. That's brilliant. What a great story. Well, good luck with it all. It's wbyatsbedfordpark.com or Yeats Bedford PK on Twitter. We'll put those links on the on YouTube and on Bohemian Britain. We've run out of time again now, but Cahal, thank you so much for coming and talking about it.
Fantastic to have the chance to talk again, Nick.
We'll have to do a third update later at some point.
You'll hear more from us. Yes, it's really going well. Thanks for your help.
Thanks very much. This is Literary London. I'm Nick Hennigan on Resonance 104.4 FM.